Our sermon text this morning is taken from Paul's first letter to the Christians in Corinth, the Corinthians, chapter 9, verses 16 to 27. We've been kind of doing a series of readings through 1 Corinthians. And in this particular reading, Paul is defending himself against the accusation that he has been preaching and working among them to seek personal gain. And he points out that he's preached the gospel free of charge. He earned his own way because it's his calling. It's his position on the team. He writes, "Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my rights in preaching it. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. This is the word of the Lord."
Thanks be to God.
Almost all of us have been on a team of some kind at some time. I mention that because next week, of course, is Super Bowl Sunday, which is a celebration not just of American football, but really it's a celebration of teams, right? We don't root for the game, we root for teams. And, of course, sports isn't the only place that we're on teams. Almost every job involves a team of some sort. We've been blessed lately to have a team in our office of 2 treasurers, a bookkeeper, and an office manager. And I got to tell you, our church is running a lot better thanks to these ladies.
Yay.
There's a shout out there. Of course, if you're in a music group, you're also on a team. It takes teamwork. So the Super Bowl isn't just a football game, it's also a halftime show. And if you have a successful family, that also depends on teamwork. It shouldn't surprise us that the church has been created by God as a team. And I want to focus on that today because in Paul's remarks, in defending himself against these charges in Corinth, he talks about his role on the team. And I'm convinced this is not just for Paul. This is also something that speaks to us, to the particular attitude we're to have and the spirit we are to have as members of God's team, united together in a common mission. And I want to bring out 3 things in particular that I think are really important about this reading. And the first is, as members of God's team, we give according to our gifts. According to our gifts. It's not uniform. It's based on what God has given us. So, pretty obvious in this reading what Paul's gift is, right? He says, I am compelled to preach. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging a trust committed to me. Which is the Christian attitude. We again and again talk about the fact that God created everything. Everything we have that's good comes from God. And it's given to us in trust. We are given these things not to hoard them for ourselves, but in order to do God's will, in order to serve one another. We just heard this, and oftentimes Paul uses the analogy of a body, right? That different parts of the body have different functions, but they're all meant to work together. They're all tied together. And they're all, therefore, important. And if you think that there are parts of your body that aren't that important, you probably haven't stubbed your toe lately. All of us are connected. We're all meant to work together. And this is how teams are. If you think about it, in football, of course, you have your small, explosive running backs, and then you have your calm, methodical kicker. It's a very different gift. And then you have your big, aggressive tackles. And they can't really do each other's jobs. And they all work together, even though some of them will never score a point in their entire career. Nonetheless, they're part of the winning team, and the team depends on them to do their job. And it's that way in the church. Paul's gift was preaching. I kind of get a hunch sometimes in reading his letters, he might not have been the best counselor. Right? When you go into counseling, you want someone who will listen carefully to what you say and help you to reflect on it and just subtly direct you. You probably don't want an entire church full of preachers. And they probably wouldn't be effective in counseling. On the other hand, a counselor, someone who's really good at listening and thinking through your emotions, might not be the best administrator. Right? They may not be the person that you turn to who needs to crunch the numbers, who needs to get the details straight and figure out how to allocate resources for the entire organization. But then again, an administrator might not be the person you want to publicly present the gospel in a compelling form. They're all different gifts. And Paul talks in Corinthians and other letters that he writes about the variety of gifts. It's huge. Each of us is differently gifted. But all of these gifts are meant to work together in service of God's purposes. And this is true, I want to point out, even if you're not particularly passionate about using your gifts. Even if you don't feel that God's calling you to a particular thing at a particular time, nonetheless, Paul says, if I use my gift voluntarily, I have a reward. And if not voluntarily, I'm just discharging a duty. I recognize that this gift has been given to me to use to serve. Years ago, I read that if your job satisfaction is below 40%, you might want to consider changing jobs. That stuck in my mind because at the time I was in a job and my satisfaction, was probably about 40%. And so I started considering where God might be leading me, and eventually He did lead me into a different ministry, a different way of serving. But in the meantime, I kept doing my job. I didn't just stop until I felt led to do something else. In the meantime, I was getting paid to do a job. I discharged my duty. That's not a bad thing at all. It's how the body operates. We do in response to what God has given. And we do for the sake of each other. Even when we don't feel particularly emotionally drawn to a particular form of service, we continue. That's okay. That is life. I know there are some people that say, wow, I love every part of my job. Most of us, that's not the case. We're doing good if we're up around 80% maybe. In the church, that's also not the case. There are times when we have to do hard things that we're not particularly called to. But we do them in order to glorify God. It might actually glorify God more when we don't feel emotionally called to do something, but we do it out of obedience. We give according to our gifts. The second thing I want to pull out of this text, though, is this. We make use of all possible means. Paul is the example about that, and he talks about that. He says, to the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. Of course, we have to ask, well, what are all possible means, right? I could sneak into hospitals and baptize babies on the sly. Would that be the correct means? No, that would not be. That's not the example of Jesus. So when we're talking about all possible means, we talk about the fact that we are called to represent Christ, which means we have to use Christ-like means. I talked about that a little bit last week if you were here, that it's not enough to speak the truth. If you're not speaking the truth in love, you're not representing Christ. because that was how he came to us. Yes, I know he was hard on the religious people because they should have known better. But think of all of the hurting people, all the sick people in our gospel reading today that Jesus served out of love, with no expectation of return necessarily. And this is the example for us, that we, in fact, serve others out of concern for their needs. And what that means is that we adjust our particular approach based on their needs. You know, many years ago, missionaries used to go into a country and they would teach people English and they would teach them to dress like Westerners, and they were surprised by how ineffective the gospel seemed to be. And then they discovered, wow, if you go in and learn their language and learn their culture, people are much more open to hearing the gospel. They understand that they don't have to change nationality or ethnicity in order to have this God who came to save the world, not one particular ethnic group or another. And we continue that legacy of adjusting how we approach people based on their needs and their culture and their language. I have a friend who has always been a great example of this for me. When I first met him, he was actually my waiter in an Italian restaurant. And I got to talking with him, found out that he was actually the son of some Lutheran teachers from Nebraska. And he was down in Houston where I was living. He was, I think, maybe taking one college class at a time and working in an Italian restaurant in order to supplement his surfing habit, because that's what he was really there to do. But we got to know each other. He became involved in my church. And from the busboys at this Italian restaurant, he learned Spanish. It was Houston. All of the busboys speak Spanish. And he got better and better. And through one of them, he got connected to a church that was a Hispanic congregation in a part town that was shifting from Caucasian to Hispanic, and they met in an old Lutheran church. And eventually the Caucasian people who were moving out turned the keys over to the new, young Hispanic congregation. And when that congregation's pastor lost his subsidy and couldn't live there anymore, my friend was the closest thing they had to a pastor. He was a musician. He was using his gift playing guitar and playing keyboard, so he was learning Spanish one song at a time. And he became the shepherd of this flock. And he eventually enrolled in what's called distance education leading to ordination. It was a 6-year program where you could stay in place and become a pastor. And by the time he finished those 6 years, he'd made a number of changes. So, for example, this congregation, they had a cry room, but they preferred to have their children with them in worship. And so he turned the cry room into a sound studio and recorded Tejano praise music, which was their outreach to the neighborhood and to the community. And by the time he'd completed those 6 years, he had also trained up another person to serve as pastor of this congregation. And he became the head of what's known as Lutheran Inner-City Networking Coalition. And in that job, he went around to various immigrant groups in the city, all of them new immigrants to America, and he recognized who the leaders were, and he helped them to form churches. And it was very multi-ethnic. There was, I remember when I visited, there was a Nigerian congregation and a Korean congregation and an outreach to Hindus from India, and of course several Hispanic congregations. And they were all different, but they were all on the same team. They were all part of reaching out to new people for Christ. And I remember noticing once when my friend visited me, something interesting about his nature. He was talking to a friend of mine who was a native Spanish speaker, and I noticed he always wore a ball cap and he pulled it down over his eyes, and all of a sudden I got it. Blonde hair and blue eyes did not really suggest commonality with the person he was talking to. But when he pulled his cap down, you couldn't really see these bright blue eyes. He was emphasizing what they had in common. And when we talk about all possible means, that's what we're talking about. In a world that focuses on our differences, we are called to focus on what we have in common with people. And what we have in common with people is the need for Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, who wasn't my ethnicity either. But he came for me, and he came for you. So when we talk about all possible means, we talk about stepping out of our comfort zone and going into other people's world, into other people's culture. And that's risky. It seems risky, at least. It's uncomfortable at the very least, right? To step into somebody else's life, to minimize those differences and maximize them, but that's exactly what Paul did. You know, Paul was Jewish by birth, but he says, to the Jews I became like a Jew, because he no longer considered them that. He said to the non-Jews, the Gentiles, I became like a Gentile. If they were really hung up on the law, I observed the laws. If they weren't hung up on the law and they had a pagan background, I would go ahead and violate the Jewish law in order to reach out with the gospel. And to the weak, to those who were vulnerable, I became vulnerable. Now, it's not that he was breaking any of God's laws. It's just that we recognize that Jesus has freed us from the burden of the law. But sometimes we need to restrict ourselves in order to reach out to other people. Sometimes we need to take risks. There's a pundit years ago who said, you know, all churches start out as risk takers. They all start out with people trying to reach new people, and there are risks involved in that. 2 out of 3 church plants fail. But if they succeed, very often churches become caretakers, right? They're just taking care of the building. They're taking care of the people that are there. And you know what happens? What you become if you keep focusing on caretaking? You become an undertaker. You become an undertaker. You end up ultimately burying the things that you have gained. If you don't learn to go back and take new risks, if you're not willing to consider how culture is changing, how new people are an opportunity that God has sent, then you will become undertakers. I had to think about this a lot. When I first got out of the seminary, I was called to a small rural congregation half-time, and the other half was I was supposed to start a new congregation in a suburb of Portland. And the first thing I did was try to meet some of the leaders of the community. And I remember meeting the head of the Chamber of Commerce, who also happened to be an Assembly of God pastor. And I said, is there any way I can kind of introduce myself to the community and I can get to know people and get a flavor of the community? He said, I try to support all of the Chamber of Commerce events, but there's one coming up that I just can't support. I said, what's that? He said, it's a Blues and Brews Fest. His holiness background wouldn't have allowed him to be part of that. And I said, I'm Lutheran! We have more trouble with the blues than we do with the brews. So we set up a booth that said, we're on a mission from God. And that was our outreach to the blues festival. And we did face painting for kids, and was that in itself going to start a congregation? No. But it was a way of reaching out in a new and interesting way. And in fact, we tried 4 different things to start a new church. The first 3 failed, but we kept risking. And eventually, God used one of them to gather a congregation. And that's what I mean by we make use of all possible means. We see opportunities that God lays before us to do his work in new and interesting and exciting ways. You know, in fact, it's interesting because this month, February, that we've just started, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on love because of Valentine's Day. And it's worth remembering that Jesus writes to the Ephesians a letter at one point in the book of Revelation that talks about love. The Ephesians is the most successful of the churches, of the 7 churches Jesus writes in Revelation. They've done so many good things, but Jesus says there's one thing that's lacking. You know what it is? You've forgotten your first love. You've forgotten your first love. Think about that. When you are first in love, you take risks. You go way out of your comfort zone because you're so excited about the possibility, and there's joy in that. And this congregation in Ephesus had lost that joy. They'd lost that ability to take risks. They were victims of their own success. And Jesus says, rekindle it. Rediscover your first love. We make use of all possible means. And here's the third thing I want to bring out. We pursue God's purpose. All of this energy would be for nothing lasting if it weren't directed towards God's plan. And we know what God's plan is. God's plan is that all people would come to a knowledge of salvation. He loves every single one of us. If there had been only one person on the face of the earth, Christ would have died for us to reconcile us to God, to give us a new future. But he did it for all of us. And it was a new way of working. In fact, when it's predicted in the Old Testament, God says to his people, he says, behold, I'm going to be doing a new thing. You're not going to be burdened by the law anymore. I myself am going to come to you as he did in the person of Jesus, and I'm going to set you free from the law through the substitution of this spotless lamb. And that's the story of Christianity right there. That God loved us so much that he wasn't willing to sit by and just let us go to hell literally. He was going to intervene in history in the person of his Son. And you and I are called to be part of that same mission. That's what Paul's talking about when he says, I don't run like a man running around aimlessly. I don't fight like a man just beating the air. No, I beat my own body to discipline myself so that I'm not disqualified for the prize. And sometimes people get this wrong, I think. They think that what we're working for on earth is to be on God's team. Here's the thing. We're already on God's team. He himself, through the gift of Jesus, has made us part of his team. It's a gift. It's by grace. What we're struggling with is playing our position. That's what we're struggling with. We're struggling with the idea that we're not sitting in the bleachers. We're on the field. Whenever we go out into the world, we are in a place to represent Jesus Christ through whatever gifts we have been given. This is our particular role on the team. And we're called to have that same goal. When I was a sophomore in high school, my family moved from Illinois to Washington State. My first time moving to the Northwest. I loved it. It was wonderful. There was only one downside. And that was in Illinois. I was on a championship football team. And in Washington, I was on the worst team in the league. Just the worst. I mean, we won so few games, and I was in the wrong position. It was awful. But one of the things I took away from that was interesting was the difference was not the athleticism of the individuals. There were many very athletic people in Washington, just as there were in Illinois. The difference was whether the team cooperated to a common goal. Whether we each were covering each other's backs. Whether we understood that we were all in it together. Because the losing team, it seemed like everybody was out to make all conference for themselves. And ironically, only one player on the team did. Our punter. Because we gave away the ball so often, he got lots of practice giving it back to the other team. I kid you not, that was the only all-conference player on our team. In the church, we are also called to work together for the same goal. If we all have different goals, we lose. If, on the other hand, we are all united by God's goal for us, without a doubt, God will score. He will win over some people in this world through our efforts together. See, that's the prize that Paul talks about here. The prize is not, it sounds a little bit that way at the end of the verse where we cut it off. The prize is not his being in heaven with Jesus. That's already a given. And if you read the rest of Paul's writings, you know that. It's completely by grace. It's completely a gift. No, what his prize that he's pursuing is this, that he would have a part in bringing other people to know Christ. That's what Paul is pursuing here. That's why he says, my prize is only this, that I would give the gospel away for free. Because that's the way we receive it. We've been given for free this opportunity to have a close relationship with God, one that lasts beyond this life into eternity, where heaven and earth and we ourselves are remade and perfected. And we want to be able to share that with other people. It's our position on the team. Paul says it's not that we're working to win a laurel crown. He uses the word crown. What he's referring to is the original Olympics didn't give people medals. They gave people little crowns of laurel leaf, which you can imagine how long that lasted. He says it's not that. And he doesn't say this, but it's not a Super Bowl ring either. What we work together for is not even a deluxe suite in heaven. What we work is something that is lasting, which is the ability to share with others this opportunity that we have to be in a relationship with God that lasts for eternity. In Jesus' name, amen.